So my name is Lori, and I am one of the PC coaches for those of you who may not have met me before. If you're able to, go ahead and turn on your camera because it's easier to talk to faces than it is just names on the screen. How are you guys doing today? Good. So today we're going to talk about contracts, but we're going to go a little bit deeper than the purchase agreement and the listing agreement. And we are actually going to talk about some contingencies that a seller may have that, normally in a purchase transaction, a seller doesn't have any contingencies. But sometimes you meet a seller who also needs to who wants to sell their house, but they want to purchase another house and they don't want to, sell their house unless they're actually successful on purchasing the other house. Or you have a buyer who's in the reverse situation where they want to buy a house. Well, same situation, but they're the buyer instead of the seller. So anyways, today's topic can get a little bit confusing because sometimes when we're talking about buyer and seller, in this case, the buyer is a buyer on this side of the transaction, but he's a seller on this side of the transaction. And so it can get a little bit confusing. Sometimes my mouth doesn't always work in unison with my brain. So if you hear me say seller or buyer and you think I'm saying it backwards, stop me and ask me to clarify because sometimes I do make that mistake. I am going to try to put some names to the scenario, and I don't know, I've never taught this with names, and so it might make it more confusing. I'm hoping it makes it less confusing. But just to clarify, so today we're going to be talking about a client that wants to purchase a home, but before they purchase the home, they've got to sell their home. And so we're going to be talking about a buyer and a seller. And then the seller is also a buyer because he's buying someone else's house. So have I confused you all yet? Zach's following along. I hope the rest of you are. Okay, so I'm just going to put some names and I'm going to try to refer to them as buyer seller. So for example, whoops, wait a minute, I lost you guys. So for example, in this scenario, Bob is going to be our client. Bob is buying a house, but he's also selling his house because he's got to sell his house in order to buy the new house, right? So Alan is going to be the buyer that is buying Bob's house. Okay. And then Chris is going to be the seller. Bob is buying Chris's house. So we've got Alan, Bob, Bob, and Chris. And I'll try to make it make sense as we go. So the first form, and I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. So when I share my screen, I lose sight of a bunch of you. And so if you have questions, I may not see that you have a question. So just unmute yourself and ask me the question. Okay. So if you just raise your hand, I might not see you. Also, when I share my screen, sometimes when I switch from one screen to another screen, you guys will just see black. So if that happens, let me know so that I can unshare and reshare so that you guys can see everything. Any questions so far? Okay. So
I
then,
have a question.
yes.
Is this is not a command class, but a contract class, right?
This is a contracts class. So what happens is Brittany does a weekly workshop, and usually the first Monday of the month, I do it for her and I teach a contracts element. This is not the first Monday of the month, but Brittany needed to trade days. And so it's the last Monday of the month, but I'm doing the contracts class. And so Brittany will be back next Monday doing what she normally does. Okay. But that's how the workshop goes.
Okay, thank you.
Okay. All right. So let me share my screen. We're going to talk about two contract forms today. Okay, this is the seller's purchase of replacement property. So in this case, Bob Bob is selling his house, but in order to sell his house, he needs a contingency that he's able to buy the next house. Because if he can't buy the next house, then he doesn't want to let go of his existing house. Does that make sense? Okay. So in this instance, this would either be an addendum to the purchase agreement, or it could be an addendum to the counter offers, depending on when this form comes into play. Okay. So seller's purchase of replacement property. Okay, so Bob is selling his house, and this is a contingent to him buying the replacement property. So first of all, there are three options that we have here. Okay, give me just a second. Okay. Seller's purchase. So the seller here is only going to sell if he finds the replacement property. And so there's three options he has. So first of all, first option is that this agreement is contingent on seller entering into a contract to acquire the replacement property. So this means that he is he's going into contract to sell his house, but he hasn't found his replacement property yet. So that would be option number one. Standard language in the contract gives him 17 days to find that replacement property. So in this case, the buyer is saying, I want to buy your house, and I'm going to give you 17 days for you to find the next house. Or maybe the seller has already entered into a contract, and so he's already in escrow. And in that case, then we're going to give the other party the escrow holder's name and number. And then we have the option of and. So the and option says, not only do you get to find your replacement property, but you actually get to close on that property before you sell me your property. And this is the one that we most always want to check, because when we're representing a client, we never want to put them in a position where they're going to end up being homeless, right? And so it's all great to find that replacement property, but if you don't actually close on it, then it didn't even do you no good to find it, right? Does that make sense? Okay, so A or B, depending on whether they're in contract on that replacement property or not, but almost always check C. And that way, if something happens and they end up falling out of escrow on that replacement property, they still have a home that they own. And it sucks for the buyer of that property, but the seller still gets to keep their home.
Okay, so Lori?
Yes.
So when are most contingency sales done with A or B and C then? Is that pretty standard, right? So when I have bought homes, I didn't even notice, but that's how it was probably articulated in the form.
Yeah. Yeah, it should be. If it's not, then maybe you just got lucky. But yes, you want to protect your client by marking this box. Because it would suck if you're under contract to buy a house and sell your house, which is what this scenario would be. You fall out on this side, but you still have to sell, because now you're going to end up homeless, right? And this protects them from ending up homeless, that box right there. So sometimes one box can make a huge difference.
Yeah, but if you're in contract, you do both B and C, right?
You would do B and C, yes. Yeah. Okay, and then we're going to talk about time periods. So this is basically giving you the option of, do the time periods for like your inspections and your contingencies and closing escrow, all of that, does that start today, or does that start when we go when we find that replacement property? And so generally speaking, we want it to happen when we find that replacement property, because what if we don't end up finding that property? Then we've spent money on inspections and stuff because our inspection period has already started, right? So we want to make sure that we do not check this box, because if we check this box, then that means it remains as specified in the agreement, with the agreement being like the purchase agreement. So we want it to default to those timeframes begin after the seller delivers to buyer a written notice removing the finding replacement property contingency, meaning they've found their property and they're under contract. Same with the buyer's deposit. So typically the buyer has 3 days to put their initial deposit or their EMD with escrow. And so this says that either that has to be done as soon as we go under agreement, or once that replacement property is identified. And so usually I would do it after the replacement property is identified. There's an option here that gives the seller the option to extend the close of escrow date a certain number of days if they need to. And that would be something that would be pre-agreed to here. So in this scenario, for example, maybe our client Bob is under escrow with the buyer and it's a 30-day escrow, right? But when Bob finds his replacement property, that seller needs 45 days. And so if we've got 15 days written in here, then that automatically, we don't need the buyer's permission to extend their 30-day escrow an extra 15 days. It just automatically happens. Otherwise, we would need to be in communication and make sure that, you know, all parties were okay with that longer escrow. And then I'm not sure what other terms you would write here, but you could write in other terms here. Any questions on this so far?
I mean, so you're selling a house, but you need to find your property, and you've got somebody that's interested in your home, wants to put in an offer.
Yeah.
But if you're not putting any down payment until you find a property, it's kind of like a waste of time, isn't it? I mean, is there any way of locking them in with some sort of a, you know?
Well, I mean, you're locked in, you know, you have an accepted offer. And so you're officially under contract. But if you don't ever find that replacement property, then if the buyer gave their security deposit, you know, their EMD deposit, then they just have to get it back. So basically, this is just saying, hey, we are actually under contract, but I still have to find my replacement property. And I have 17 days to do that.
But you said back down, but you don't get an EMD until you find your property.
It depends on which box is checked here.
All right. So what would you do to at least make sure that you lock that off so they don't walk? You know, I mean, because they can say, "Hey, I want out of the contract," right?
I mean, essentially, they could do that regardless.
Yeah. I mean,
And they would get their deposit back. What's that?
Even if they gave you an EMD, or
Yeah,
I mean,
even if they
there's
gave
no
you
way
the
of writing it in here saying, okay, yeah, okay.
Yeah, I mean, the EMD would be refundable to them regardless. And so whether it's done on day one or it's done after the seller goes under contract, it's still it doesn't make a huge difference.
Okay.
Make sense?
Yeah, I mean, just at this point, you're just kind of going through the motions until you do find your property.
Yeah, yeah. But you've got your buyer locked in. Well, locked in as much as anyone's ever locked in a contract. Yeah, yeah. But even on a traditional sale, where there's no, you know, contingencies like this under a traditional sale, I mean, yeah, they give their deposit, but if the buyer, you know, finds something they don't like, they can back out and get their deposit. So it's, you know, they're still outs. Okay. So then removal of contingencies. So this says that that even after the time frame for this agreement expires, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels Once buyer receives seller written removal, the finding replacement property contingency, buyer may not cancel. So what that's saying is that,
You can cancel until I find a property.
yeah. Yeah, even after the expiration of this contingency, seller retains the right to remove the finding replacement property contingency or cancel the agreement until buyer cancels. Buyer can cancel for certain reasons. So buyer can cancel if the seller fails to remove this contingency, if they fail to close on the replacement property, or if they're unable to meet the timeframes. But buyer could cancel anyways. Buyer could cancel for inspection reasons. In addition to that, seller can cancel the agreement if they are unable to enter into a contract to acquire the replacement property, or if they're unable to close on that property, if paragraph 1C up here is checked right here.
But at any time though, the seller can release that contingency and say, hey, I'm selling it. And then we start with the EMD and move on, right?
Yeah, but that would be releasing the contingency to find the replacement property,
Right.
not necessarily the contingency to close on that replacement property. So from the buyer's perspective, so I'm the buyer, I'm buying this house, but that seller has this contingency in place, right?
Mm-hmm.
The seller can technically cancel up until the day before they close escrow if that escrow falls out. So as the buyer, there's, a trust factor that we're going through all of this and that the seller's actually going to close on escrow. Because if they don't, then as a buyer, I'm on day 30 or maybe day 47, and all of a sudden I don't have a house to buy because the seller still has this contingency.
Mm-hmm.
And a lot of that's dependent upon what happens with the house that the seller's buying, right?
Mm-hmm.
And you can have scenarios where this is in place, like it's dominoes. Like as a seller, I'm only selling my house if I buy this one, but that seller's only selling his house if he buys the next one. And so it can go, multiple layers on this. Like hopefully it doesn't go that much, but if one thing falls out, it's like dominoes and it kills all the other deals below it. Okay, so I know that this is kind of a confusing form, but let me open this up so I can see everybody here. Any questions on this before I move on to the next confusing form?
I have a question.
Yes.
So what you just described about the seller's replacement property falling out, and then that seller can cancel up until the last day of escrow, that's only if that box at C there is checked. Is that correct?
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Otherwise, seller would just be screwed because they would still have to sell to the buyer and they have no new house to move into.
Okay, got it. Thank you.
And that's why when we're representing sellers, it's important, in this scenario, it's important that we have this contingency in place and that we mark that box. Okay.
Lori, is there
Yes.
you can find these forms that are pre-filled out with like that C check? I mean, I know you guys always review our offers before, but you know how you have some of the other forms on our Google Drive?
I'd have to look and see if we have it in there or not. I'm not sure right offhand. I'm guessing we do, but I might not. So if you go into our contracts and you see it's not there, like send us an email and then we can get it added.
Thank you.
Yeah. But I mean, when you read through the form, and I know, as agents, we need to know, it's very important that we know what we're filling out when we fill it out for a client. So as we're reading through this, we can see there's lots of different options that we need to be reading and say, okay, this is what this means. This is what that means. And if you do, then it's kind of obvious that you'd want to check this box. It doesn't mean every agent does, because we see contracts where it's not, you know. But that's that. So let me share the next form with you. And this is where,
I can't, you know, I came in late and I apologize for that, but did you talk about, I mean, so this is somebody's put in an offer and then you counter with this?
so you might put it in with the offer, or you might be countering. It
Well,
just
you're the
depends.
seller, so they're putting in their offer, so it's an addendum to their RPA, right? Or counter, so it would be a counter offer.
It'd be addendum to a counter offer. Yeah.
Okay, got it.
But if it was in the MLS and the agent knows, okay, this is going to be contingent upon the seller finding a property because it's in the MLS agent notes, then you might submit this with the counter offer. I mean, with the original RPA, especially
Okay.
if you're trying not to be, if you're trying to avoid being countered back because you want your client's offer accepted,
Yeah.
you might be proactive and submit this with the RPA.
Got it.
So it could go either way.
Yeah.
But there's a good chance it would come back with the counter offer.
Oh, yeah. That's okay.
Yeah. Okay. So then let me go back. And we're going to go to the other side of this. So this is the contingency for the sale of the buyer's property. So on the form we just used, that would be the seller gives that to the buyer. This would be a buyer giving it to the seller. So this would kind of be that second scenario where our client Bob is buying the next house. When he put in his offer, he would attach this, which is the contingency for the sale of his property as he's buying the other house.
And it's a COP?
It's the COP form.
Contingency of selling buyer's properties.
So most likely this is going to be an addendum to the purchase agreement, because as the buyer, when you submit your offer, you're going to attach this to your offer. And up here where it says dated, it's going to be, because it's an addendum to the purchase agreement, it's going to be the same date as what the purchase agreement was, which is probably the same day as today. Okay, so we're going to fill out the top part, and then we get to here. And there's a box at the bottom where, just like on the other form where I said you want to make sure you always mark that one box, there's also a box on here that you're always going to want, that you're most always going to want to mark. I don't want to say always because there's different scenarios, but okay. So in this one, okay, so again, contingency for sale of buyer's property. So I've got to sell my house in order to buy your house. So either it's contingent on me entering into a contract and closing on the property, which means I have not found my replacement property yet, or wait, I haven't found my buyer yet. Or it's contingent on only entering into the contract, which I wouldn't recommend that one, or only the close of it, because we're already in escrow. So we have an escrow company and an escrow number. So we want this to be, well, it automatically defaults to. It's entering into a contract for the sale and closing. So I can't see a scenario where we'd want to check number B, because number B is only entering into the contract. So I don't see a scenario where we'd want to do that. So we're just going to pretty much use the default language here, unless we're already in contract, and then we'll fill out the contract information. And then we have to, once our offer gets accepted, we would have 2 days to give them, to give the seller of the property that we're going to buy, the seller, evidence of us already being in contract. Because if you think about it, the seller's going to want proof that your house is in contract and that you're getting it sold, right? So there's a number of different things here where we're going to provide proof to the seller in order for them to sell it to us. Okay. So the buyer entering into contract for sale of buyer's property. So the buyer has 17 days after acceptance to enter into a contract for the sale of buyer's property. So that means that once my offer is accepted, I have 17 days to get an offer accepted on my house. And then by the earlier of the time specified, so by the earlier of that 17 days or 2 days after I enter into the contract, I have to deliver evidence of that contract to the seller. So that's what we were just talking about right up here. So I have 17 days to find a buyer from my house, and then I have 2 days to get that contract over to the seller so that they can verify that we're actually under contract. Does that make sense?
Yeah, so this is connected to 1A or 1B.
Yes.
So, if you're not in contract yet, you got to do C. I mean, you got to do B and then put timelines down here on this one.
Yeah, okay, so because 1A and 1B means we haven't entered into contract yet. We don't have a buyer for our house that we're
Right.
selling yet.
Right.
C means we already have the buyer. So that's the difference between that. So
Right,
on number 2, we have 17 days to find the buyer, and then we have 2 days to deliver evidence that we're under contract. So a copy of the RPA.
Okay. So if you haven't found a property yet, you have to mark B, 1B.
Uh-huh.
And then you go down and fill out time frame to that because 2 pertains to if 1A or 1B applies.
Yeah,
So
but
check.
let me correct you on one thing. So we probably don't want to check 1B. We're going to probably let it default to 1A because 1A is entering into a contract and closing escrow. 1B is just entering into a contract, and that doesn't protect our client.
Okay, so A default, and then if we're going with, we didn't check anything, we don't have to worry about 2.
Correct.
Okay.
Correct. Well, because we do because it's 1A or 1B applies. So 1A, so if we don't mark anything up here, 1A still applies.
Okay, okay. So then
and so what this is just saying, so standard language is 17 days. So we have 17 days to find a buyer. But if we want to be more competitive, we could say we'll have 10 days to find a buyer. Or if we don't think we can find a buyer in 17 days, maybe we say 25 days to find a buyer. The larger we make this number, the less attractive our offer is to the person we're trying to buy their house, right? Because then they are dependent on waiting for us to find our buyer and for our buyer to close the transaction, right? Okay. Then here's the other thing. So a lot of times we talk to people, clients who want to, they want to sell their house and buy a new one, but they want to find the new one first, right? But that's where this comes in. So this is where we're saying, okay, Mr. and Mrs. Seller, who we want to buy your house, we either already have our property listed in the MLS or we don't. So this is saying, this right here says that we have already signed a listing agreement to sell our property, or we have 3 days to sign a listing agreement. So imagine somebody's trying to come and buy your house and they don't even have theirs listed yet, right? It's a lot less desirable of an offer. And then this says, okay, so we do have it listed, but is it in our local MLS, or are we using an agent from out of town and it's not in our local MLS? Because that might, not as many buyers are going to see it. So we have to disclose that information. And then it says that we have to deliver evidence of the listing agreement, to show that we have our house listed within 1 day after going under contract. So here's the thing. If I don't even have my house listed, let's say my house comps at 400,000, right? But I think that I'm going to get more for that. So I'm going to list my house at 475,000. Now, what are my chances of quickly finding a buyer if I've got my house priced 75,000 over what it's worth. Not
Well,
very good, right?
nope.
So over on this side, when the person whose house you want to buy is looking at it, they're going to say, okay, you don't even have your house listed, or you do have it listed, but you've got it way overpriced. So I'm not going to accept your offer, or, you know, whatever the case might be. So that's part of the reason why this information is here. And then we go to closing of escrow on the buyer's property. So if 1A or 1C, and that's because B does not include closing of escrow, B is just entering into contract. So if 1A or 1C apply, then the buyer has until the scheduled close of escrow to close escrow, or are we wanting them to close escrow 5 days before they buy our house? So basically this just identifies when we're closing escrow. Usually they need to close at the same time because the buyer needs the buyer needs the money from this house to buy that house. And so usually it's going to be just defaulted at the scheduled close of escrow. On number 5, what this is saying is that you have to keep the seller informed on what's happening with the sale of your home. So if it falls out of escrow, if the dates change, you know, whatever's happening with it, we have to let the other party know so that they, because it can affect their closing, right? It affects me purchasing their property. And then we have like 2 days to do that. So what this is saying actually is that we have to provide proof that the contingencies have been removed on the sale of our home. Because this guy over here wants to make sure that these guys over here have removed their contingencies. And again, that everything's going smoothly. If that escrow gets canceled, so if my buyer backs out and says, nope, I'm not going to buy your home, then we also have to, you know, notify the seller within 2 days. Okay, so I know that was a lot. Any questions on that? Okay, so then we go to backup offers. And this is where a certain box, so this one right here, this 7C3 right here. For the most part, you want to make sure that this box gets marked. And what this box does is this box says that 7B, which I'll talk about in a minute, doesn't apply. Okay, so that's what this does. 7C3 cancels out 7B. So let me explain that. So first of all, what this says is that the seller has the right, even if they accept your offer, they have the right to accept backup offers. So they can still show the house, they can take backup offers. What 7B says is that if the seller accepts a backup offer and provides a signed copy of it, that the seller can then do 3 things. They can force the buyer to remove this contingency. So even if, as the buyer, you don't know if your buyer is going to go through, if your sale is going to go through, if the seller accepts a backup offer, they can force you to remove this contingency, to remove the loan contingency, and to provide verification that you have funds to close without the sale of your home. So most buyers aren't going to be able to do that. So basically what this says is that if you refuse to do those things, as the seller, I can cancel on you and I can take this new offer. And that messes up, if you're already under escrow with your buyer, that messes up their transaction too, right? Because all of a sudden you can't sell your house anymore. Assuming you have that box marked on that other form. And so so if you come down by default, 7B just happens immediately. You can change it so that the seller can't do that for the first 17 days, but after 17 days, the seller can do that. Or you can check 7C3, which says during the entire time of the agreement, the seller is not able to accept a backup offer and force you out. So that's why it's important that that gets marked. Now, if you're representing the seller, you might not want that marked, but if you're representing the buyer, you definitely do want that marked. Okay, any questions on that? No questions? Okay. So then we come down to removal of contingencies. In a typical transaction, a seller really doesn't have any contingencies, right? But this form gives them, so a seller doesn't have a way to cancel. This form actually gives them 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 ways to cancel the agreement. So if you have a buyer who wants to buy a house and they don't have to sell their existing house, like they qualify to buy the new house without selling the old house, but they just want to sell it, you might suggest that they don't use this contingency, because the big way that a seller can cancel here, so right here on 9G, if the buyer gives notice to seller of either party's cancellation of contract for the buyer's property. So what this means is if the buyer backs out and decides not to buy your house, the seller can cancel. Even if that buyer says, wait, they backed out, but I have cash. I can still pay cash for your house. I don't need them. It doesn't matter. Seller can still back out. So if they've taken a backup offer that's a higher offer than what they're under contract with, and your buyer backs out, all of a sudden seller no longer has to sell to you. They can now sell to the person with the higher offer. Most of the time, they're going to need to sell their house to buy your house, but sometimes they don't, but they just want to use this. So just keep that in mind. We've learned that the hard way because that was an actual scenario that happened, and they didn't have to have the buyer to buy their house, but the seller had a better offer and canceled on them. So any questions on that? Okay. And then of course the buyer has the right to cancel as well. They can cancel if they're unable to find a buyer for their property, or if they're unable to close escrow. And then this is just right here. Time for performance is, again, do the time period start when the RPA is accepted, or does it start when we find a buyer for our next house? And same with the deposit. Is the deposit due when the RPA is accepted, or is it due after we find a buyer for our house? And then this last part is if up in this 7C area up here, if they are giving the notice to remove contingencies, then that can get done on this bottom part here. Okay. So as I said, both of those forms, I was going to try to put the names in it, but it was more confusing to me to put the names in it. It gets confusing because I'm talking about buyer, but I'm talking about this buyer and that seller. So I apologize if I confused you guys. But I wanted you guys to at least have like an overview of these forms, and you probably need to read them to really, absorb what they mean and kind of have a scenario in your head. But they're important. And like I said, each one of those forms has a specific box that I think is important that gets marked every single time. And so make sure you're aware of those boxes. Okay. So there's one other form that I wanted to go over with you guys today. If your brains are not like completely fried by by everything. Did you say almost?
Uh-huh.
Yeah, I know it's a lot. It's a lot. and I don't know how to teach that without making it more confusing, because it's, buyer, seller, buyer.
Well, I mean,
This
it's funny that this is coming up right now because I did an open house this weekend and there's like 2 people that came in are in this situation and there's already an offer on the home with this contingency. But they have to go list their property and put it on there. So if that's been accepted and I have my client right now putting their offer in with the contingency, am I just getting in line, or can they do they accept that offer? You see what I'm saying? So that if that first offer went in with that contingency, if he accepts that, then my offer is going to be a backup offer.
potentially.
Okay.
And a backup offer only officially becomes a backup offer if that backup offer form is filled out. Otherwise, it's just a second offer that's there.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, they got to respond back to you with a
with the form.
form.
So, but
So
I mean,
find out with that agent to see if he's accepting or when he's accepting offers, right?
yeah. And then, like I said, depending on whatever form they're using, whatever they've filled out can affect like what happens, in regards to backup offers. Can they take them? Can they not take them? Can they force them to, allow them to cancel the other party? So there's a lot of things there. Okay, so this one's a bit easier, guys. This is the seller in possession. So this is where this is just like, forget everything else that we just talked about. Although this form can get used in those scenarios. But this is just, I'm selling my house, but after escrow closes, I want to stay in possession for X number of days. The seller in possession form gets used for 29 days or less. There's another form. It's called the RLAS, which is residential lease something. I don't know what it is. But that one is for 30 days or longer. And that one is more detailed than this one. And after if you look at that one and see what's all on that one, you'll be like, oh, wait, let's see what we can do to make this less than 29 days, because this form is way simpler to use. Okay. And you can see that if you have property, like if you're selling your property and buying another one, and they're closing at the same time, you might want to use this SIP form to stay in possession for 3 or 5 days. That gives you time to move your stuff out and move it into the new house. So, but that's not the only time this form could get used. Okay, so seller in possession. So this can be an addendum to a purchase agreement, or it can be a counteroffer on either the seller side or the buyer side. So this right here, the seller's granted a license to remain in possession of the property for X number of days, and that would be 29 days or less after the close of escrow, or it can be a specific date. So maybe I want it to be until November 15th. Seller has no right to remain in possession beyond that term and may be responsible for court-awarded damages if seller, refuses to leave. I want to come back up here really quick. So we're using the term license to remain in possession. We're not using the term rent, and what they're trying to do with the language in here is avoid tenant landlord relationship. So right here it says, buyer is advised to consult with qualified local landlord attorney to discuss whether the possession could be interpreted as creating a landlord-tenant relationship between buyer and seller. Local rent control and other laws regarding tenant rights may impact buyer and seller's rights and obligations. So while they're specifically using a license to remain in possession term, what they're saying is, that doesn't necessarily guarantee that you're not creating a tenant-landlord relationship here. And then, of course, tenant laws, come into play, and eviction and all of that if the seller refuses to leave. The other thing here is that, and this is the same with the RPA, and a bunch of people don't realize it, but close of escrow shall be day 0 for the purposes of counting days. So let's say that this was a 3-day license to remain in possession. If we close escrow today, Monday is day 0, and then we got Tuesday, Wednesday, Thursday. So they would have until Thursday at 6 p.m. to vacate the premises. If you don't know that today's day 0, then you're thinking it's Wednesday. So that's important. It defaults to 6 p.m. I like to change it to midnight, or maybe 10 p.m. But that way it gives the seller the entire day to get out. The new buyer's not there like saying it's 6 o'clock, they're not out yet, and panicking. And then the next morning, the buyer then gets possession of their house, right? So I like to change it to later, but it doesn't have to be. Okay, so in consideration for the buyer letting the seller stay, they have the option of charging a non-refundable license fee, not rent, of X number of dollars per day or X number of dollars. A lot of times you'll see that a seller is asking for the ability to stay at no charge to the seller. And that's simple enough if it's a day or two, but you got to remember the buyer is now taking on a new mortgage, and let's say it's a 15-day seller in possession. Well, that's half a month, right? And if my new mortgage payment is, $3,000 or $4,000, I'm paying that mortgage payment, right? I mean, I guess the first month, technically you don't pay it, but still. So do you put an amount here? Do you not put an amount here? That's up to your client. There's a late charge here. The late charge shouldn't come into effect, or like the non-sufficient check charge, because up here you have the ability to check this box that says that money is held in escrow, or released to buyer. So I like it to be held in escrow. Well, wait, on this one, so we're talking about money that goes to the buyer. I don't like it held in escrow. I like it released to the buyer. So in other words, if the seller is going to pay $2,000 to stay here for 15 days at the close of escrow, I want that to be released to the buyer because it's going to be the buyer's money anyways, right? Down a little bit further, there's another thing I'll talk about where it's the opposite of that. Okay, and so since it's already released to the buyer, we're not dealing with, late charges or insufficient funds, so that's not really a big deal. And then we come into seller's obligation for condition of the property. So who's going to maintain the property, right? Well, you got to figure the buyer just bought this house, but they haven't moved into it yet. Seller's staying for an extra 2 weeks. Seller's going to maintain it, and that's what it defaults to. Seller's going to maintain, the pool, the spa, everything, and give it in the condition that it was in when they accepted the agreement. So the condition basically that it is in today. So if the pool is blue and the grass is mowed, we're not going to get it where the grass is now 2 feet tall and the pool's green, right? That's what this is saying. So here's a delivery of possession. It just says basically what I just said. And then there's a delivery of possession fee. Now this one, I like to put an amount in here. A lot of times it gets left blank, but this is basically like a security deposit. And this says that if you don't return it in the condition that it's supposed to be in, then I'm not going to return your security deposit is basically what this says. And so this might be, $2,000. And what this means is that when we close escrow, the seller is going to get their money, but they'll get it minus that $2,000. And then after the seller moves out in 2 weeks, then they'll get that $2,000 at that time. And this is where I want it to be held in escrow, because I don't want the buyer to get the money and then be responsible for, turning the money over, because buyer might have went and spent $2,000 on new furniture and now doesn't have the $2,000 to give back. So just hold it in escrow and it's easier, right? Seller agrees to pay for all utilities and related utility services, which makes sense because, again, seller has been living there the entire time. Nothing's been changed over to the buyer's name yet. And so seller's going to continue to pay until they move out. Seller shall make property available to buyer for purposes of entering to make any needed repairs, to show the property to maybe tenants, potential tenants, whatnot. And so this is saying that there needs to be a 24-hour either written or oral notice, but then, so seller does have to make the property available to be seen. Does the key get given to the new buyer, the new owner at the time that we close escrow, or at the time that they move out 2 weeks later? That's depending on whether you check this box or not. Seller's not allowed to sublet it. Insurance. So the seller's going to have homeowner's insurance, right? But once escrow closes, seller's no longer the homeowner and no longer eligible for homeowner's insurance. So at that point, they would need renter's insurance. Will an insurance company give renter's insurance for 2 weeks? I don't know. So that would be something that they would want to discuss with their insurance company. But basically what this is saying is that the seller's personal property is not insured by the buyer. And that if anything happens, that's 100% on the seller. So where sellers maybe lived in this house for 10 years and has always been covered by their homeowner insurance, they're no longer covered for these last 2 weeks. So if let's say there's a fire in the house, the buyer's new home insurance is going to cover that fire, but the seller will be out. They'll just have lost all of their stuff and they'll be out. If there's any other terms or conditions, supplements, you would write that there. But going back to like the fire, or where are we at here on maintenance? Maintenance right here. So seller shall maintain the property, all personal property. But what happens if a pipe bursts, right? So you could think of this scenario where the buyer just bought this house. They haven't even moved into it. Seller hasn't moved out, but buyer actually owns the house now. And now there's a pipe that bursts. Who's responsible for that pipe?
Buyer.
Buyer is, right?
Mhm.
But you could see where that could cause a big issue. So
Yeah, so if the pipe bursts and causes damage to the person's personal property that's still living there, the seller's personal property, then that's why you want them to have their renter's insurance covering that stuff.
Yeah. But because you think, a seller isn't necessarily comprehending that they no longer have insurance that covers their stuff. They're just like, oh, we're just going to stay here for 2 more weeks, no big deal. But there are things that go into that buyers and sellers don't think about. And so that's where this form outlines who's responsible for what. Any questions on this form?
So I think, let's see, it says right there that you should use the RLAS as well.
So the
regardless of the
RLAS,
length of time.
the RLAS is only used if it's longer than 29 days.
Yeah, but go back to that contract right there. Go back to the SIP. In the first paragraph right there, it says parties are advised to use residential lease after sale, regardless of the length of the time of possession. Buyer is advised to consult.
It says
with the landlord.
right before that, it says if occupancy is intended to be for 30 days or longer, parties are advised to use the RLAS. And then regardless of the time of possession, buyer is advised to consult with a qualified local landlord or attorney.
Got it.
So whether they're there 3 days or 3 months, they're recommending that they talk to an attorney. I want to show you guys the RLAS form. We're not going to go over it because we've only got like 4 minutes left, but I want to show it to you really quick. So this is over 30 days. So over 30 days, now you've got, let me see, 1 page, 2 pages, 3 pages, 4 pages, 5 pages, 6 pages, 7 pages, 8 pages, and then you've got some disclosures and different things.
Yeah, it's a lease agreement.
So, and this goes into a lot more details, and then you've got bed bug disclosure, you've got tenant flood disclosure, like all these things, right? So this is where, and when you start looking at some of what they're asking, it's just way more detailed. And so if you can avoid doing 30 days or more, I've seen agents that are like, okay, we're going to do it for 30 days. And then they're like, they see this form like, oh, no, never mind. We're going to change it. So something just to keep in mind. But all those forms are designed to protect your clients. And I've seen transactions go where it's like it's just written as an addendum or written in the counteroffer that the seller is going to stay in possession for 3 days. But if you don't use that form, then those items aren't disclosed. No one's, so like use the form, right? It's there to protect your clients. All right. So I know this was an intense session with those first 2 forms, but I want to thank you guys for being here. Before we go, couple questions, just a couple minutes, but any last questions on anything we talked about today?
I do.
Maria. Yes.
I'm actually representing a seller right now that wants to stay in the house for 7 days after close of escrow. So will they have to turn off the utilities after they leave, like not close of escrow, but 7 days after?
Yeah, 7 days later. Because it makes sense that they're going to still pay their utilities while they're there. And that's
Yeah.
what that form defaults to. So
Okay. And I should advise them to talk to their insurance company to give them those 7 days or see how they
yeah,
do.
I don't know what the insurance companies could do. I never asked the insurance company, but it's something that they want to have that discussion with them. So at least they know what their options are and what the consequences are if they're not able to do anything.
Right. Okay.
It-
I think that's it. Thank you.
Say would it be included in if you bought, like, so if you were listing the property and you bought that insurance while you were listing it, I wonder if you could include that or extend it, something like that.
I don't know how that would work because you're not.
I'm gonna go. We got our office meeting right now, so I'm gonna ask the rep.
There you go. Hey, that's
Yeah.
good. Yeah. Let us know.
Yeah, I will.
All right. Thank you guys. Have a good rest of your day.
Bye. Thank you.
Bye-bye.
Thank you.
Thank you.